cool stuff. So on the call also are Nikki Dix, the co-collaborative lead, Caitlin Dietz, the co-collaborative lead, and Tess Adji, the project technician for our Experimenting with Elevation project. And I believe, okay. So I just wanted to give some context to our project. So our project really rose out of this science information that we gained from a previous project in which we were working at the GTM Reserve, looking at all kinds of below ground processes and how plants, in particular mangroves that are encroaching into these marshes, are influencing the below ground processes which are sustaining elevation in these wetlands. And so this is a good example of sort of when science has to lead to action. And so we parameterize this MEM model, which some of you may be familiar with, that we are now calling in partnership with Jim Morris, the QUEM model, Coastal Wetland Equilibrium Model, because we're now able to use this model for mangroves as well as marshes. And so the science result that I'm talking about is the fact that if we look out over the next 100 years, over 3 different sea level rise scenarios, 40 centimeters in blue, 80 centimeters in black, and 100 centimeters in red, you can see that for Spartina alterniflora, the marsh grass that's predominant at the GTM NERRR, you see that essentially, oh, sorry about that, essentially the marshes are going to collapse over the next, less than around 50, 60 years. And that will happen at, not all sea level rise scenarios, but ones that seem very much likely. And yet when we look at the areas that are dominated by the mangrove, which is encroaching into these wetlands due to climate change, we see that these wetlands are able to keep pace with sea level rise, both in terms of biomass as well as in terms of the relative elevation. And so Nikki and I were at a conference and sort of said like, okay, well, what are we going to do with these data? And so this really, this Catalyst project arose out of that with the need to actually think about some restoration strategies for elevation at the reserve. And so this led us to our first goal for the project, which is to identify portions of the reserve that are particularly vulnerable to habitat loss. So the QUEM model that we built in a previous project is very process oriented, and we need to sort of get to the spatially explicit level in order to find areas at the reserve that are actually particularly vulnerable to collapsing over the next 50 or 60 years under different, these higher sea level rise scenarios. And so the end users, of course, are the reserve managers and staff, as well as some other land managers in Northeast Florida, including the Aquatic Preserve, some county land managers that we've been working with, as well as the local water management districts. So our approach has been to take this MEM model and then move into using a spatially explicit model, the INVEST model, to develop a coastal vulnerability index. And we're doing this work both on the ground as well as, from the air, so to speak, with GIS. And so I'll just give you a little preview of our outcome thus far. The INVEST model that we're using is producing this coastal vulnerability index with lots of different layers: wave exposure, elevation, surge, and in particular natural habitats, because as I told you before, the way that mangroves keep up with sea level rise in these habitats versus the way that marshes are predicted to are different. And so it's really important that we get that habitat layer correct in order to understand in areas with habitats, which are the most vulnerable sites in the reserve. And so this is a map of the reserve with the red areas being more vulnerable. And then we can also use this product to actually look at, what role are these habitats playing? So you can imagine a place like this with habitats which has a lower vulnerability index in the southern part of the reserve. However, if those habitats are not there, this is really red. And so it's showing the high value that that habitat is playing in preventing coastal erosion and inundation in these habitats. And so this is preliminary, but it allows us to then identify sites that are potentially particularly vulnerable. And so what do we do with this information? Of course, as a science collaborative project, is we work with people to figure out what to do. And so that's our second goal, which is to engage land managers and scientists in a new collaboration to investigate management options that could potentially maintain or increase wetland surface elevation. So these strategies include things like sediment deposition, which there's a lot of interest in the area by the Army Corps to do this kind of work. It includes facilitating mangrove encroachment or sort of just letting the mangroves be. And this includes living shorelines, lots of the management strategies that many of you may be familiar with. And so we have 2 workshops that are bringing together this unique and really, I'd like to say, awesome team to engage in this communal restoration planning. And so this started with a survey that Tess developed in partnership with Caitlin to all of the stakeholders. And then Tess and I went, and luckily, because Caitlin told us about all the great people to talk with, Tess and I had individual meetings with them to sort of get a sense of their engagement in this, the restoration that they're interested in, their experience with any of these restoration strategies. And we had our first workshop. And so the outcomes of that were that we actually were able to make these kind of restoration stories that various stakeholders and end users told to the rest of the group, which was important for forming this collaboration. We went through our survey results, and we're starting to do this kind of site prioritization homework. We've also identified some science gaps that I think will be really helpful in kind of moving to the next stage of this kind of work in what we need in order to do some of these pilot restoration projects. And so that's what's next, right? So we're gonna select these sites using the index that we've developed, and then help with this large group of collaborators figure out how might each restoration strategy, at least in theory, based on the experiences of this large and awesome group, work at these selected pilot sites at the reserve.